I'm reviewing today Charlotte's Web by E.B. White. This is actually the second video I've made this week on this book because what I do on this channel is when I start a new book, I make what I call a started video in which I explain the reasons I've picked up this book or why I've been wanting to read this book. And then when I finish the book, I come back with a full review. And because I'm a slow reader, quite often there are many weeks or sometimes more between when I start a book and when I finish a book, but not so in this case. I'd forgotten how easy these books are to read. I'm coming in with my review now, but I actually finished this book in just a little bit over a day. I think I could easily have finished it in one day. I mean, it's only 184 pages. It's large print with lots of pictures in it. It was such an easy read. Anyways, in that original started video I made, I talked about my history with this book. This is actually a reread for me. As with most people, I was exposed to this book in elementary school and haven't read it again for years, and I'm coming back to reread it now. I'm not going to repeat everything I said in that started video because the whole point of making those started videos is to try and get rid of all that extended throat clearing in which I'm talking about my history with the book, why I wanted to read it, etc. The idea is I get that all out of the way in the started video, and then in this video, the proper review video, I can just talk about the book itself. But I am going to repeat myself a little bit because it's a book like this. It's inevitable that I do have to set my reactions to the book now against my memories of the book from when I was a child. It was notable on the comments to that video. I got 3 comments on the started video. 2 people, Mindy and Kelsey, say that they remembered the book from their childhood and they had very fond memories of it. And then Jim, who said that he didn't read the book when he was a child, who just recently read it. And I'm wondering maybe if this is breaking down among national lines because Jim, I believe, is British. The other 2 commenters are fellow Americans, right? So perhaps this book is more universal in American schools than it is in British schools. I don't know. Let me know in the comments below what your experience is. But my temptation is to say that almost everyone has read this book in elementary school or had it read to them by a parent or a teacher. But possibly I'm wrong about that, or possibly it's more of an American thing, or I don't know. Let me know in your comments. But the general assumption I'm going to make throughout this review is that most people are familiar with this book from childhood, but perhaps have not reread it in years and might be, like me, coming back to this book for the first time in many years and being like, yes, I remember that part, or I've completely forgotten about that part. And, being surprised by things that were in here that maybe they forgot about. So that's going to be how I'm reviewing this book. The assumption is that you know the general story, but maybe you've forgotten some of the details or some of the narration style or something like that. And if you're not familiar with the general story, spoilers, because I'm going to go through and I'm going to talk about the plot, and I'm going to assume that most people are familiar with the basic plot. Okay, I guess the first thing to notice is if you are like me, grown up in the 1980s or 1990s, you might be surprised to see that this book now has full color illustrations. As far as I can figure out, these full color illustrations were added in 1999. I'm going off the information on the copyright. Originally, it was by Garth Williams, who did the original illustrations, who since died, but they got someone named Rosemary Wells to do the watercolor after he died, and I guess something about the technology, computers or something, makes it much easier to do this now than in 1952 when this book was originally published. To my mind, these full color illustrations are all for the good. It just makes the illustrations so much more eye catching. I don't know if there's any controversy about adding in the watercolors after the original illustrator has died, because it seems like the kind of thing people could get touchy about. I don't know. Is there any controversy about that? If there is, I'm not aware of it. And yeah, to my mind, it just makes the illustrations pop up all the more so. So I'm a big fan of the full color illustrations. The other thing, which I noticed upon rereading it, is there's a rather strange shift in perspective. So the first two chapters are not from the perspective of Wilbur. Again, I'm assuming people are familiar with this book and remember it's all about Wilbur and Charlotte. But something I had forgotten is that the first two chapters are actually from Fern's perspective. Wilbur is the runt of the litter. Fern's father is going to go out and kill him because he's the runt and he's not going to survive. And Fern runs out and saves Wilbur. And then the first two chapters are about Fern taking care of Wilbur, and they're from Fern's perspective. Then we get a rather abrupt shift in chapter 3, where Wilbur becomes the main character, and then the narration is taking place from Wilbur's perspective. It's slightly jarring, and I went to Wikipedia after I finished reading the book to get a little bit more information. The extent of my outside research is Wikipedia, by the way. And Wikipedia says that originally the book started with chapter 3 in the original draft. And then E.B. White added chapters 1 and 2 later. So that explains maybe why there's this weird change in perspective on it. From there on out, Fern is a rather awkward tacked on presence to this book. For example, I mean, here's a scene where she's there, where Templeton is taking away the egg that didn't hatch, Templeton the rat. But if it weren't for this illustration, you'd never know that Fern was here, because there's nothing in the narration that lets you know that she's here. And then a couple chapters later, she's recounting the event to her mother. So then, okay, we know in the narration that inside the narration of the book that she was there, but it's odd. And then, chapter 7, Bad News. This is the infamous chapter when Wilbur finds out what they do to pigs in the winter, that he's going to get turned into ham and bacon. And Fern is here, but she's like a really tacked on presence. It says at one point Fern stiffened when the sheep says what's going to happen to Wilbur. And then it says Fern was just about to jump out when a voice was heard, and then that Charlotte's voice. So you could rewrite this chapter without Fern being here at all and lose nothing. And in fact, it seems a little bit strange that we don't get more of a reaction from Fern about finding out that Wilbur is going to die, because in the next chapter, she's talking to her mother about the barnyard conversations and doesn't mention anything at all. I couldn't find this written down anywhere, at least not on Wikipedia, but it really seems like Fern was just added in later, or that Fern's story arc was added in later. Either that or E.B. White just didn't know what to do with her, because her integration into these barnyard scenes is really awkward. So that's another thing I'm noticing from an adult perspective. But anyways, while I'm talking about that, I might as well finish this up. There is kind of a dual plot going on, and like I said, it doesn't mesh together fully, or it doesn't mesh together seamlessly. It's a little bit clumsily done. But there is a dual plot going on. On one hand, Wilbur and Charlotte and their plot to kind of save Wilbur from getting turned into ham and bacon. And then Fern, who's spending a lot of time with the barnyard animals. And Fern's mother, who's worried about Fern spending too much time with the barnyard animals. I had forgotten this. There's a lot of stuff I hadn't remembered over the years. But there's a whole chapter right in the middle, chapter 14, which is all about Fern's mother going to talk to the doctor. He's just identified as a doctor, but it seems he must be some sort of psychiatrist or psychologist, about her worry that Fern is spending too much time with the barnyard animals and not spending any time with boys her own age. Sorry, with children her own age. And then the payoff to that is that Fern discovers boys at the end of the book. And is, what was his name? Henry Fenton or something? The exact name of the boy is not important, but Fern is much more interested in spending time with the boy than she is in... In fact, she seems to lose interest entirely in whether Wilbur will live or die, which is a bit strange. But on the other hand, her integration into that whole plot, into Wilbur's plot, was a little bit strange and clumsily done. So I guess it makes as much sense as anything. The beginning of this book, jumping back to maybe Wilbur's plotline, is talking about baby Wilbur, how he's being raised by Fern, how he's on the farm, and there's a lot of pastoral scenes where it talks about him rolling in the hay and the manure and enjoying the feeling of warm milk in his belly and going off to sleep, and it's just kind of very peaceful and idyllic and innocent. It's intermixed with some descriptions about summertime on the farm and the warm sun and the apple blossoms and the bees, and just some very peaceful and idyllic rural scenes, which evokes all the innocence that you would expect about a barnyard book for children. However, as you and I are reading this, because we are adults now and we know what's going to happen, we remember this book from childhood, we realize that there is a huge axe hanging over Wilbur's head, metaphorically and maybe in a sense literally, because he is going to get killed for his meat in the winter. And Wilbur doesn't realize this yet, but the other animals do know this. And then in chapter 7, the sheep tells him. Now, it's... My memories of this book, whereas it was a very innocent book about barnyard animals, and that sure, okay, there was this subplot about how Wilbur's going to get killed for his ham and bacon. But of course, the whole point of that book is that it doesn't happen, that he gets saved by Charlotte in the end. So I had kind of been thinking that introducing the whole element about how pigs get slaughtered for their meat is solely done here so that we have some sort of stakes or a plot. Because, if it was just barnyard animals hanging out for 184 pages, that would get boring. Every book has to have some sort of conflict. Every book has to have some sort of danger. So that's what's going on here, is that the idea of Wilbur going to get killed for his meat is a danger that's being introduced here, but it's only there to give the plot stakes. And the whole point of it is that Wilbur escapes from the danger. However, reading it now, or rereading it now as an adult, it's hard to cut that part out from the rest of the book completely. It seems much more that the whole world of the book is a world in which pigs regularly get killed for meat. For example, when the old sheep tells Wilbur what happens, the old sheep says, "Almost all young pigs get murdered by the farmer as soon as the real cold weather sets in. There's a regular conspiracy around here to kill you at Christmas time. Everybody is in on the plot." Lurvy, Zuckerman, even John Arable, these are the human characters. Mr. Arable, sobbed Wilbur. Fern's father? Now Fern is actually right there the whole time this is happening. It was introduced earlier that she's sitting there. But there's no reaction from Fern to this part, or no. Wilbur isn't turning to Fern at all to say, "What, your father? What's going on?" It's established that Fern can understand the language of the animals. So that's yet another part where Fern's presence here seems like it was added later. It doesn't seem completely natural. Anyways, he says, certainly when a pig is to be butchered, everybody helps. I'm an old sheep. I see the same thing, same old business, year after year. So, in this very innocent children's book, it's established that this is not, something that Wilbur gets saved from. I mean, it is something that Wilbur gets saved from, but it's something that's happening year after year. So somewhere out there in some alternate universe, there is a very dark prequel to this book about what happened the year before. The pig who did not get saved. Or it's several prequels. It apparently it's a yearly occurrence. And even at the end of the book, it's established that Zuckerman is going to let Wilbur live out the rest of his natural life, but it is not established that Zuckerman is giving up pig farming. So, you wonder what happens the next year. Is there a new little piglet that he's going to bring onto the farm? It's established that he buys his pigs from other places as piglets. That's how Wilbur ended up on the farm. So the next year, is he going to bring in a new piglet? And of course, Charlotte is dead now. You know that because you're familiar with the book. Charlotte dies at the end. So there's going to be nobody around to save the new pig. So, in some alternate universe, there's a very dark sequel to this book in which a new piglet comes into the farm and Wilbur is unable to save him. Just has to spin the whole book, and eventually he gets dragged off to be slaughtered with all the other animals watching. I mean, those kind of things you can't help thinking about as an adult. And I was initially thinking that perhaps E.B. White was just a little bit sloppy in how he was setting this up, or if he was trying to go for an innocent tone that perhaps his world, his plot didn't allow for. But the more you think about it, the more he is not trying to hide this. In fact, in the very first chapter, when Fern is rushing out to save Wilbur from the axe, it's mentioned as a minor detail that the kitchen table was set for breakfast and the room smelled of coffee, bacon, damp plaster, and wood smoke from the stove. So the Arable family, the Fern family, is eating bacon right there in chapter 1. Wilbur escapes the fate, but E.B. White is not trying to hide the fact that this is what normally happens to pigs. It's not an innocent, idyllic children's farm story, although it does have those elements in it, talking about the summer days and the apple blossoms and the lilacs and the bees. School ends, the children have time to play and to fish for trout. I mean, those elements are definitely there, but they're also set against a much darker tone. And then, of course, there's the infamous ending to this book where Charlotte herself passes away, which, if you want to be super realistic about it, that is what happens to spiders. They have a short lifespan. They don't live forever. But you don't need to be super realistic about this. This is a book in which there are talking animals, in which Fern can understand what the animals are saying to each other. The decision to have Charlotte confront her own mortality at the end of this book was a choice by the author that didn't have to get made. You could talking animal books routinely overlook the short lifespan of animals. And then there's a rather odd detail here. I don't know. This is something I had forgotten from childhood, but there's a side character, a rat named Templeton, who's a glutton. And at the end of the book, he gets Wilbur to agree. He fetches down Charlotte's egg sack. There's a picture of that somewhere. He fetches down the egg sack of Charlotte because in the book, Charlotte lays her eggs at the fair, and Wilbur's going to get crated up, and he's going to be moved away from the fair. So in order to keep Charlotte's children near him, they need to take the egg sack down, and Templeton goes up and gets it. And Templeton doesn't want to get it because he's a selfish animal, but the deal that they make is that Templeton gets the egg sack, then from now until forever, Templeton will always get the first dibs on the trough. Templeton being a rat, he usually gets whatever is left over by Wilbur. But the new deal is he's going to get whatever, he's going to go in there first, and then Wilbur will get the leftovers. So, of course, he gorges himself until he balloons up to this huge size, which is not natural for a rat. And the old sheep spoke to him about his size one day. "You would live longer," said the old sheep, "if you ate less." "Who wants to live forever?" sneered the rat. "I am naturally a heavy eater, and I get untold satisfaction from the pleasures of the feast." He patted his stomach, grinned at the old sheep, and crept upstairs to lie down. And that is the last we hear about Templeton. That's his last appearance in the book before the end of the book. It's kind of right near the end, anyways. So it's a little bit funny the way these animals talk. I get untold satisfaction from the pleasures of the feast, this is changing topics slightly, but that's one of the charming things or funny things about the book is the way some of these animals talk in overly formal ways that doesn't seem to jive with their station in life. That is throughout the book. Not only Templeton, but Wilbur and Charlotte and stuff like that. So that's just a little bit aside. So it's somewhat comical the way he says it, but then we never hear from him again, and the implication clearly is he is not going to moderate his eating. And the implication from that clearly is that he is on his way to eating himself to a premature death. And that's the last Templeton appears in this book. And again, that's a choice that the author made. He didn't have to include that part. He could have had a little epilogue where Templeton finally decided to get healthy or something like that. That choice to end the book on, or end Templeton's story arc on him eating himself to death is a choice E.B. White made along the way. So there is, more so than I remembered, a big focus on death in this book. And in fact, if you go to Wikipedia, which I did after I finished reading the book, sure enough, a lot of the commentary on this book is about death and facing mortality and the way the different animals deal with that. Which is strange because, I was read this book by our teachers when I was in first and second grade. And what first or second grader is able to fully contemplate the full impact of mortality or has any interest in doing that? It made me think a little bit about maybe why this book has become such a children's classic. And don't get me wrong, there are a lot of really charming parts in this book, and I haven't even talked about them because I've been rambling on about other stuff. But the way the animals talk to each other is very funny. As I indicated before, the overly formal way in which sometimes Wilbur will address people is funny. The E.B. White, of course, is famous for his prose style. He wrote or co-wrote Strunk and White's Elements of Style, which is a classic in American schools that was assigned reading when I was in my freshman English class at college. Again, I think this is another American-British divide. I don't think it's taught in British schools, but it's I don't know. Let me know in the comments what your recollection of Strunk White's Elements of Style is. But yeah, that's another part. There are sections of this book which really stand out. The rope swing part, I thought was a very good description of what it was like to use a rope swing. Sorry, I'm looking for the picture here. Which chapter was that? It's something that was highlighted in Wikipedia again, but I went to Wikipedia after I read this book, and I read that section. I remember thinking that is a really good description. It's a perfect description where you can picture exactly what this rope swing is like to swing on. You have the illustration here, but the illustration is superfluous. You don't need it. The description you get on the previous page of exactly what it feels like for these children to swing on this rope swing is just so perfect. Such a perfect example of how the words paint the exact picture in your mind. So for all of those reasons, it is definitely a deserved classic. And yet, why the focus on death and mortality in a children's book? It got me thinking a little bit maybe about how this book became a classic, or why, or by who, because I have fond memories of this book from childhood, as everybody does, but I did not choose this book when I was a boy. I was interested in pirate stories and stories about soldiers and adventure stories. The reason I remember this book is because it was read to me by my teachers. And if memory serves me right, was read to me by multiple teachers. I think my grade 1 teacher read it to us, and then my grade 3 teacher read it to us as well. Sorry, I've been living abroad for too long. First grade and third grade in American English. So is this a kind of book that is a classic because teachers like it and not because children like it? Or here's another random thought that occurred to me. How many books from childhood do we actually remember? Maybe, our teachers read us 100 books in grade school, and we only really remember the ones that pack an emotional punch to them. So maybe because this does deal with heavy themes is the reason, that Charlotte's death at the end of the book, I think, is something every child remembers. Or every adult remembers when they first heard this scene as a child. So perhaps the stories that stick in our minds are the stories from childhood that do try to deal with these more serious themes, because when you think about it, a lot of the classics of children's literature are stories that deal with the characters coming to terms with death, and you can list those books off as well as I can. So I don't know. I guess the what I'm trying to say, or the long and the short of it, is that I was coming to this book expecting to recapture a bit of childhood innocence, and maybe had forgotten what a macabre book this is in a lot of ways, or how this book is not all about childhood innocence, how it's dealing with some heavy themes. So I've used up all my time talking about the heavy stuff in this book, and have not talked about any of the fun stuff in this book. And there is a lot of fun stuff to talk about as well. But I'm up to my 30-minute time limit. So I'm just going to have to finish here. Thank you for listening. And if you haven't checked this book out in years, it might be worth checking it out again. And let me know what your memories of this book are.